Calling the Fiscal Committee meeting to order. First of all, I need a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting, please.
So moved, Aguilar.
Second.
Moved by Aguilar, seconded by Jamison. Questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Item number 3, reports and updates. 3A is discussion of authorization of city contracts. I'm going to ask Deborah Owen to come forward. I had asked her to do more research on what we see other cities doing in terms of contract authorization. So, Deborah, please present.
Thank you. Deborah Owen, City Clerk, Chief of Council Operations. And before you is some of a recap of previous memos. We start with state law. As you know, we're a home rule charter city and a strong mayor form of government or mayor-council form of government, but when there's a general law of the state, of course, in regards to municipalities, that governs. And so we start there, and we are following that now. I just wanted to start there. So it's a statute in SDCL 915, and it has the general rule, which has that the governing body must authorize a municipal contract to be valid. But it also creates an exception to the rule, which allows the governing body to delegate the authorization of contracts to any employee of the city. And then I have it quoted down below where it says no contract of a municipality is valid unless the contract has been authorized by a vote of the governing body at a duly assembled meeting thereof. And then where it has the exception, it will go on to talk about that you may delegate that to any employee or of the municipality the authority to enter into the contract on behalf of the municipality and to execute the contract, and any other instrument necessary or convenient for the performance of the contract, subject to the limitations delegated by the governing body. And then a few months ago, we also looked at City Charter 2.11 subsection C, and I put an ellipsis in here to get to the part that's the most pertinent in this issue, but it talks about voting. And that's where it says the City Council must approve all expenditures for the city in excess of state bid law limits by a vote of 5 council members. And then on to, so that's a kind of a repeat of what we've looked at before, and just to recap, because we haven't met in a month. We skipped a month. And so as you move forward to shape this policy as you so deem necessary, to provide more oversight of the city's contracts and agreements, you could also utilize the option of approving the majority of these contracts under the consent agenda. Many governing bodies do that, where they do that by one vote. So you wouldn't be voting on hundreds of contracts in a council meeting by a particular vote. It would be, you would put those under the consent. I think school boards do this, county governments do this, and many of our own municipalities in South Dakota do this as well. Okay, so then on to this, the issue was to look up and to see how is this law being interpreted and being implemented in some of our larger South Dakota cities. And so generally speaking, City Council in larger South Dakota cities authorize all contracts over $25,000 except for the city of Sioux Falls. The contracts ordinance in Fiscal Committee provides that you're looking at now that all contracts in excess of $20,000 would require council authorization with 2 exceptions. The emergency contracts provision, which allows the city engineer to enter into contracts without approval of the council, but then within a certain amount of time would give a report back to the council for the basis of the emergency and then the selection of the contractor to repair, such as like the sewer issue we had recently would be a good example. And the second exception to the approval, that $20,000 threshold to authorize contracts, would be the state price list purchases. As you know, that's kind of already cleared through some of the hurdles, and it usually are pretty sound purchases in terms of having been made sure that they're a proprietary price. So then we looked at some of those cities, and this is very brief, and these are fairly close. Some are estimates in terms of the I didn't put all the dollars and cents in, obviously, on some of these. But if we'll look at Sioux Falls, current ordinance, the ordinance that's in place now, has the mayor authorize all the contracts with very few exceptions. Those exceptions are found in city charter. Things like the cable franchise ordinance, that has to be authorized by the council. And then our population, of course, is 153,000 or 154,000, and our annual budget's about $3.8 million. And the reason why I wanted to include some of those population in the budget numbers, because I think we want to look at this in context of the size of the city and the possibility of the number of contracts that would be approved. You don't want to look at, it's difficult to find the number of contracts year to year, so we looked at the annual budget for all of these cities and hoping that that would be some sort of an indication of the size and the scope of their budget. Rapid City has an ordinance in place. They approve, the governing body or the city council approves all contracts for those that are $25,000 and over, and also if they're a year longer, if it's a multi-year contract, those go before the city council as well. So if it's a $14,000 contract, but it's for 3 years with a certain vendor, then that would come before council in the city of Rapid. Their population is about 65,000, and their annual budget is $163 million. In Aberdeen, it is very much the same way. They approve all contracts over $25,000, and again, they have a policy on that. There's an exception to the rule with Parks and Rec. Those are approved by the Parks and Rec Board, and that's the sole exception to the rule. But overruns for those contracts then go before City Council for approval. Their population is about 25,000, and the annual budget's about $51 million. Watertown, we spoke with that finance officer. All contracts are approved by the City Council. Again, the exception is the Parks and Recreation Department, which are authorized by the Parks and Rec Board. And if they go over a certain amount, then of course the City Council must approve those additional funds. Population's around 20,000, and annual budget's around $41 million. Yankton is a little bit different. The City Council approves all the contracts for the city, and the City Council can pre-authorize the city manager or department head to sign the contract, but the City Council approves the contract first. There's an exception for contracts under $1,000. Population about 12,000, and then their annual budget's about $37 million. And so those are some of the larger cities in South Dakota. The smaller cities we have looked to, those contracts are all approved by council. So these are the exceptions, and again, you're seeing that state law implemented where the governing body can choose to delegate some of those contracts to a department or to the mayor to authorize without having council approval. And then, in addition, we wanted to look at some of those strong mayor forms of government in our region, and then some really large metropolitan cities. Some where you would have a very large billion-dollar budgets, obviously an extraordinary amount of contracts that would be authorized by council. Because that's one of the concerns is the city council as a legislative branch, because they adopt policy and appropriate money, is it an administrative function to approve contracts. And what we have seen, of course, we've talked about before Omaha, which is strong mayor, and St. Paul, which is strong mayor. And in both of those cities, the city council approves the majority of those contracts. In Omaha, all contracts over $20,000, and that would be in the aggregate as well. What you sometimes see when we spoke with some of the staff there of the council, you might see a contract that may come through for $19,000 and $19,000 and $19,000 for the same vendor. So that's in the aggregate. If it's a vendor per calendar year, it has to be no more than $20,000. Otherwise, it comes before council. Their population is about 408,000, and their annual budget is $662 million. And on a side note, unfortunately for Omaha, they have about $3.5 million in damage to the floods so far, and that cost is mounting. So they are working through their challenges. But they have a wonderful team there who works for the city council. In addition, St. Paul, the city council approves contracts over $50,000. Their population is 205,000, and their annual budget is $553 million. And then to jump ahead to look at some very large metropolitan cities, and Houston, Texas is a strong mayor form of government. The city council approves all contracts over the state bid law limit of $50,000. And prior to 2008, the governing body or the city council there approved all contracts for the city of Houston. In 2008, the charter was amended by the voters to allow for only the approval of contracts in excess of state bid law limits. And that's where that $50,000 comes into play. Their population is about 2 million, and their annual budget, I just got an update today, is about $4 billion, so much larger. They have an incredibly neat system of how they send those contracts through council with memos, and so I have that for down the road for further discussion on this if the council desires that. But they do approve, the governing body there approves most of the contracts for the city. And Detroit, Michigan, which is the biggest yet, they approve all contracts over $25,000. But contracts between $25,000 and $5,000 are still monitored by the council staff. Council receives notification of these contracts, and their council staff may flag specific contracts for contracts within that $5,000 to $25,000 range for council approval. And the example I was given by the person in Detroit was having, again, 3 different contracts for the same vendor that were under that $25,000 threshold. In that situation, council staff would have flagged that because in the aggregate it would be over the $25,000. It goes before council for approval. Contracts under $5,000 are not monitored by the City of Detroit's council staff, and they do not come before council for approval. They are a population of about 4 million. It's the 8th largest metropolitan area in the country, and their annual budget is about $3.2 billion. Any questions?
Thank you, Deborah. Other questions for Deborah Owen? If not, just as well, first of all, I need to welcome Councilor Karski to the Fiscal Committee. I neglected to do that. Thank you for being part of the group.
Thank you.
And as a way of introduction, Councilor Aguilar and I met with the City Attorney's Office, the Director of Finance, and Mark Cotter, Director of Public Works, to look for ways that we could improve what we're trying to do in terms of contract authorizations. And City Attorney Fifley agreed to bring us a proposal, so he is here to walk us through that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and fellow committee members. Dave Fifley with the City Attorney's Office. I will beg your indulgence today. I have lived a life for almost 2 decades of sitting around and arguing over placement of commas in statutes with judges, and also reviewing several different statutes that all apply to the same subject matter. And I'm not embarrassed to say that very few of us enjoy that protocol or regimen, but I'm afraid I have to admit I'm one of them. In looking at this issue, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity and your guidance in terms of stating the goals that the Council, in terms of the Fiscal Committee, wanted to achieve with contract approval process. And I also appreciate the opportunity to present another proposal for the committee's consideration. The 3 goals that were stated by the committee were transparency, oversight, and council awareness. And the biggest concern identified, at least by you, Chairman Brown, was council awareness. In broad terms, what the proposal in front of you would do is provide you with the bid request forms for any item that will go to the competitive bid process, and that is approximately 60 to 90% of all the city contracts and agreements. It obviously varies according to department, but you would be given, and that would certainly satisfy the awareness factor in particular that the committee had been discussing about. Logistically, you would be provided with a bid request form 5 to 7 days before it's actually publicly put out for bid. Those bids are then advertised for 2 consecutive weeks, and then they are on the Fridays, and then they are not actually opened until the following Thursday. So the council would have sufficient time to know what the bid request will be, what the planned expenditure of funds would be, and certainly you would have time to ask questions of the affected department, particular folks involved, and you could certainly provide oversight that way. What's interesting from a logistics point of view is that the bid request form, when you look at it, contains several paragraphs of what they want the particular vendor to do. Most of those paragraphs actually become the contract that is later approved. In our office, we certainly add a few of the basic legal paragraphs, such as they have to comply with the anti-discrimination ordinances. We add a paragraph that they can't expect funds beyond 1 fiscal year, and that if the council decides it's not going to appropriate those funds the next fiscal year, then the contract is void. And we add some other protections, such as the vendor is an independent contractor, but most of those are very standard. but the actual meat and bones of the contract itself is contained in that bid request. So the council would be getting the actual paragraphs that will, in almost final form, for what would go into that contract. In terms of analyzing the other issues, certainly, I mean, Ms. Owen has touched upon one statute, but there are other statutes that also have the same subject matter. And under any rules of construction and interpretation, a court is going to look at all the statutes that govern that same subject matter. Now, the state legislature in 2010 went through a massive rehaul of the competitive bid process. And in that process, they in particular defined what a purchasing agency was. And it's interesting to note, and that's SDCL 5-18A-1, subpart 21. It defines a purchasing agency as any agency, either a governing body or a public officer authorized by law to enter into contracts. It's interesting that this most recent enactment talks about a public officer being authorized by law. And as you're all aware, our law, governing law, is the city charter. Now, under the city charter, we have a couple different sections, and I've alerted you to those. In addition to the 2.11 subpart C that talks about voting, there's also section 5.10. Now, 2.11C talks about an appropriation or any action needs a vote of at least 5 of the council members rather than a majority of those present. You couple that with 5.10 that talks about before any obligation or payment, the mayor or his or her designee has to certify that there are sufficient unencumbered funds available. When you read those two together, it satisfies the way the current system is done. This council makes their appropriation. There is an allotment. There are unencumbered funds. The administration executes upon the policy of the council by certainly negotiating and entering into contracts with vendors that will execute that policy if the city is not able to do it itself. 5.10 requires that there be a certification. That certification is done through a routing process where finance, the city finance officer makes sure that there are sufficient unencumbered funds. Our office certainly goes through it in terms of all the legal language of the proposal, and also it then goes to the affected department, obviously, and all those have to be signatories before the mayor can even consider approving it or not. Now, what's interesting about our city charter that's unique, and it's different than any of the other municipalities that were mentioned in Deborah Owens' July 1, 2011 memo, is that our 3.01 section has a very unique language to it. It says, it first started in March of 1994. I'm a bit of a history buff too, bear with me. The first draft only talked about executive power vested with the mayor. But then it later added in another draft, administrative power and executive power would be vested in the mayor. How important is this specific language? Certainly there is a list of what are administrative versus legislative decisions, and there's a state statute that defines exactly what those are. And under, if I can find it, bear with me. I think it's 9-19, that chapter talks about the various administrative versus legislative decisions. I had the opportunity to meet with Joe Kirby, who actually would have been the first drafter of the charter. And he lives in California, so I've been having trouble getting a meeting with him. But it's interesting that I showed him this list of what administrative decision would be, and I'll show it to you. And I asked him point blank, oh, pardon me. Site is 9-20-19. Administrative decisions. And I asked Joe Kirby to look through that list and asked him if he agreed with those should be under the province of the mayor. And his response was absolutely. And you'll notice I asked him in particular whether the awarding of contracts and negotiating of contracts should be within the province of the mayor or the council. He said we were all along contemplating those would be within the province of the mayor. All the other municipalities cited within the July 1, 2011 memo. Rapid City, that's a statutory municipality. It's not a charter. Aberdeen has a different city charter. They do not have our section 3.01 that talks about the mayor having administrative and executive power. Watertown is a charter community, but it identifies the mayor as the chief executive officer. It doesn't state administrative power. Yankton is a 9-member commission. They hire a city manager, a totally different statutory or charter scheme. Omaha, Nebraska has a different charter, and I didn't have time to look at St. Paul, Houston, or Detroit. But in terms of how this legal landscape should be done and interpreted, I think the awareness concern is certainly being satisfied while complying with charter. The oversight concern is certainly being addressed by you folks not only having notice of anything from a competitive bid process, but also any contract that's over $25,000, any change order that's over $25,000 is being provided notice to the council. As far as oversight, again, we need to interplay that with what the legal landscape allows. I believe that the proposal we have on the table is one that satisfies the charter, the specific and unique legal landscape here, but yet addresses your concerns in the best way possible. As a practicing lawyer, that is our challenge every day, is how to provide to clients how to do what they want accomplished, yet do it within the legal framework involved. And I would submit to you that this proposal, as submitted, will accomplish your goals to the best ability we can within the legal framework involved. And certainly we have some other folks here that could address any of your practical questions involved.
Questions from the committee members? Councillor Jameson.
David, looking through your draft, where did $250,000 come from as far as a threshold?
Those thresholds, Councillor Jameson, there is no magic to it. I'll admit that. In terms of how, something substantial in terms of trying to work it out between administration and council, that was something that kept coming up as perhaps that's a good threshold number so that, for lack of a better word, the very large contracts of very import are still coming to council for approval.
Councillor Jameson, if I may add to that, when Councillor Aguilar and I met in that meeting, we said $250,000 was too high. And that clearly is not reflected in this draft.
So I'm just trying to read between the lines here a little bit. You met with two of our members. They said 250 is not appropriate. Somebody's telling you 250. David, where's 250 coming from?
Councillor Jameson, I've been meeting both with council members and also with administration members, trying to come up with something that they could agree with, yet keeping the legal landscape in mind, and the number 250 kept coming to me from others.
Well, if what I recall was, I think we were struggling between all contracts and some dollar amount. If I can not a big history buff, but that's about as far back as I can recall. And $250,000 would be, I don't even think it was on the radar, but I'm not sure what the amount should be. I think that's been our struggle all along, and now we've got this quite a large revision to consider, and I guess I'm struggling to understand what our real purpose was when we initially started this process some months ago. If I could ask the chairman to really just re-inform me, if you could, on what our initial purpose was.
This is a discussion that's been going on for years on the City Council regarding what contracts get approved, what don't. This group of council members has made it a priority, and that's what has generated these discussions to the level they are today.
Okay.
Councilor Aguilar.
David, a good portion of what you've presented to us has to do with purchasing. Is that true? I mean,
Well,
so are you
I'm
looking
sorry.
at, there are quite a few refinements or changes. It wasn't just renumbering, is what I'm taking it. It wasn't just recodification in your document. It's
I'm
more
sorry.
than just looking at contracts.
Well, it's within that chapter 34 and a half, Councilor Aguilar, and that's all dealing with purchasing, but also it affects certainly public works. And that's the section that this committee has identified in terms of how it would enact any ordinances to affect any change regarding the contract approval process. And certainly, the two main generators of contracts are public works, but also the purchasing department with Scott Rust and the finance team.
When you talk about legal landscape, are you saying to us that what we are proposing doing is illegal?
I think it would violate the charter, Councilor Aguilar, because of the very specific language that's used to vest the powers of executive and administrative matters with the mayor. And certainly that's bolstered by talking with the person who made the first draft of the charter.
But again, that was the first draft. It wasn't what was the final. And again, 18 years later, I would have to say that there are so many changes. They thought that council members would work 10 to 12 hours a week, and any council member here can tell you that that's a fallacy.
Again, Councilor, with all due respect, any time you are interpreting law, you go back to the beginning, to the legislative history, what was intended. And there was absolutely no equivocation with talking with Mr. Kirby that the mayor, as a strong mayor form of government, was to have the power to award and negotiate contracts. And I just frankly met with Mr. Kirby to say, throwing up my hands, what's the delineation here? This is what it says. What does it mean? And that's what I was told it was intended. And I think that carries a substantial amount of weight.
If I may, doesn't state law still trump charter?
No, under Article 9 of Section 2 of the state constitution, our charter can establish any executive, legislative, or administrative structure so long as it doesn't violate the Constitution, but it can trump state statute.
Other questions? Councilor Karski.
I guess I'm a little, first of all, this is the one that you put up, and this is what you're proposing.
I'll take your
Your
word for
draft.
it.
And we
I
got a-
can't read it. I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, we got a-
Karski.
We have a 3-page proposal here by Deborah Owen and an 11-page proposal here from your office. It's a lot to digest, but I guess the gist of what I'm getting out of this is you're saying that it's not legal, but you're saying, well, it's okay if we have a $250,000 threshold?
First, let me explain the length of why our submission is the length that it is, Councilor Karski, is certainly when we're proposing any different amendments to the ordinances, we want to make sure they're formatted in proper order. And I certainly had Karen Leonard of our office make sure we were conforming to American Legal Publishing's requirements regarding how the ordinances should read. So quite a bit of those are reformatting and not substantive changes. So the meat of it is in that section 1.
Okay.
And the meat of it is trying to satisfy the biggest concern of this committee, which I understood was the awareness factor. 60 to 90% of all contracts are put to public bid. through the competitive bid process. You are, if this proposal is adopted, you folks would be getting 5 to 7 days advance notice before it's advertised. Then you'd have another 10 days while it's being advertised. Certainly, we're talking almost, 2 to 3 weeks. You can ask questions. You can do your oversight. If you think something's wrong, you can ask. You will have that advance notice and that awareness before any funds are being spent or a contract is being awarded. For the other items that aren't competitively bid, you're getting notice on anything above $25,000, and then you're also having approval for anything over $250,000.
For other questions, I have a couple regarding that. I appreciate and like the idea of the invitation for bids approved by the mayor shall be provided to the city council prior to the advertisement for bids. However, there's no oversight in that because it's communicated to us only through communication. So there's no checks and balance there. So even if we disagree with one of those contracts coming through, the council has no way to counter that, correct?
You have oversight, Mr. Chairman, because you have power of the purse.
But if it's appropriated and the contract isn't approved by the council in any way, the money could be spent without a vote of the council, correct?
You would have a time...
Because we already appropriated.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Because we've already appropriated the money and no way to come back and say, no, the council doesn't agree with this contract.
You still have the power of the purse, and you could amend that appropriation or repeal it. I mean, you have time. If that's an issue, Mr. Chairman, you would.
With permission of the other members, I do have several questions that I'd like to go through. Page 1 of the ordinance, middle of the last paragraph, any contract or agreement for park purposes, you changed it from shall to may. Can you tell me why that was?
That was in discussions with the Parks Department, and they were concerned about being able to get a contract in front of the Park Board with sufficient time. In further discussions with Mr. Carney, he would be able to live with the shall language, Mr. Chairman. So if you want to change that back to shall.
What did the Park Board say about it?
I talked only with Director Kearney in particular, and not the Park Board. But I know it's a timing issue in terms of how many meetings they have a month, and certainly I think Mr. Kearney's here if you want some more questions answered on that.
Yeah, I think the initial concern up front was whether we would have the ability to get the contracts in front of the Park Board and then get it on the council agenda. And obviously some of this is coming at us a bit fresh, and so certainly from our perspective, we've had a history of the Park Board approving items that go before the City Council. And I think one of the things that we're comfortable with is that if it does go to the City Council, that it does go before the Parks and Recreation Board first. And so I think it's somewhat hard to determine where we're really at until we know really what's going to be in the ordinance for sure. And I'd certainly want to obviously have some dialogue with the Parks and Rec Board because they are pretty actively involved in what we do.
So they haven't, what is their wish at this point?
They have not been consulted on this proposed ordinance change at this point. So certainly we would be interested in taking that to them so that it works from a logistics perspective as it relates to the Parks Board.
Currently, do they do approve contracts?
They do approve gifting agreements as far as bidding and those types of things. They do not, but any management contracts they do approve prior to the mayor's signature. And so from that perspective they do, but as far as purchasing, construction contracts, those types of things, they do not. And I think it's simply just from a timing standpoint, it's just not gone through them historically.
But they haven't been consulted?
Not yet, no.
Okay. Attorney Fifley, I have more questions. Just below that, contracts in excess of $25,000, that was changed from $20,000. Can you just explain that change?
That was, in terms of, Mr. Chairman, to try and make it simple. That's all it is. The engineers out in the field are given current change order authorization for up to $25,000. And discussing it with several folks that deal with contracts, we all agreed, let's just make it as easy as possible to have one threshold so people aren't trying to remember, well, is it $20,000, is it the $25,000 that we have to notify council. This way, it was just to make it more simple so people would follow it. And that's the main thing, is if you make it more simple, people can follow it easier.
Would it make sense, instead of using a dollar amount, just say state bid law, the state bid law number? Because that will change throughout the years.
It could, and again, that's something the committee can certainly consider.
And then, I think we've covered this, but then in that same area, the mayor, or subject to council approval, shall be noticed to the city council on the consent agenda under communications, which means if it's under communications, the council could not pull one contract out of there for consideration for a vote, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay. On the next page, section 34.5-3, and bear with me because I was trying to get through this today, but in the middle, in my copy, it's the blue. In addition to the provisions in City Charter Section 2-12, my note said takes away approval by ordinance for the multiple year contracts. Is that correct? Or the prior proposal?
Oh, on 34.5-3, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman?
Yes.
Okay. The multiple year contracts. The reason that was put in the way it is that the concern was expressed that rather than having specific number of years that was placed in the other proposal, that we have flexibility in terms of if it's more than 1 year, it's going to have this language in the contract, which our office is already putting in, but this by ordinance would require it, that if the council does not appropriate for that coming fiscal year, that vendor is out of luck, for lack of a better way to put it. And it just took talking about it internally in our office, we thought it was better if we have this requirement be in the contract rather than anything in particular. Obviously, your power of the purse, again, is that you have the power to appropriate or not. If you don't like it, you don't appropriate the next year. And I think that was just trying to take away that set number of years, because it puts us in a bad negotiating position. If we can get a great deal and have one more year out, but have this provision in there as under our proposal, we may get a much better rate for the city than, oh, sorry, we can only go out 5 years or whatever the case may be. So,
okay. I see Councilor Anderson in the audience, and before the meeting we were just talking about his concerns with like leads online. So in this case, the only way that he would be able to get rid of that contract would be ask for a vote to zero fund that.
that was a unique situation, Mr. Chairman, where there were federal grant dollars used for that. I can't imagine in the current fiscal landscape for the federal government that those types of grants are going to come too often, if ever again.
Okay. Section 34.5-5 on the next page, just at the last paragraph of that, the line subject to the City Council approval was pulled. The mayor shall develop, promulgate, and update a manual or manuals. Can you give me the thinking behind that, please?
Again, going back to Section 3.01 of the Charter, mayor has the executive and administrative power. And also, the Charter was recently amended so that the mayor could certainly propose the budget in a form he saw fit. Putting those two together, it really seemed like that it was contrary to Charter to have the council telling the mayor how to administer the budget when he is the administrator for the city.
If there are any questions, please interrupt because I have a number of them here. Top of the next page. This is a new section. No claim against the city shall be audited or allowed unless it will be fully itemized in memorandum of the same submitted to the mayor. The memorandum shall be published by the city clerk on a monthly basis by vendor, expense, class, repair equipment, professional services, or other similar class and amount. What does that paragraph do?
Mr. Chairman, that is actually a current ordinance. It's just changed to a different section. I don't have the old version with me. Sorry, I'd have to get back to you. I don't have the current version handy, but I know that is not changing anything from what the ordinance currently says.
Can you display or explain in layman terms what that language does?
The vendors are each giving out a memorandum stating, what in terms of the expense class and amount involved, and it'll be published by the city clerk.
So now we're getting into the purchasing issues instead of the contract issues.
Right. And again, we lawyers, we wanted to reformat it as long as a proposal was going forward, and I apologize. This isn't part of the meat of any changes. It's current ordinance, just renumbered, Mr. Chairman.
Section 34.5-7. Again, maybe this is already in charter, but it was, or in ordinance, but it was new to me. The sections A, B, and C. What do those do?
It's just talking about, as the section title says, it's a return of deposit to unsuccessful bidders. In considering contracts awarded, no bidder shall be required to leave a certified check or other guarantee or bid bond if the bid is not accepted within 30 days. So I think that's just affecting their price under Part A, because obviously the bond's in effect for longer. But again, that's just current ordinance. B, certified checks shall be returned. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Then C just talks about a supplemental appropriation and how that'll be handled. And that's my understanding. That's all just in the current.
Councilor Aguilar.
Mr. Chair, what the difficulty is here for the committee is that even if this is just renumbering or putting in a different place, it's almost impossible for us to know what is new language and what isn't.
I agree.
So, and I think that at this point in time, what this committee's work was to look at contracts. And I know that these other things do affect, but I think it's out of the scope as far as what this committee is looking for right now. And so either it's got to be put into an easier way for us to look at it with maybe cliff notes or whatever, but it is impossible as a layperson to know what is new language and what isn't, because you use the crossing out and the underlining, and so in my mind that means it's new language, and it's not. I'm getting
Right.
that.
Can I
from what
lay
you're
it
saying.
out right now with the cliff notes, Councilor Aguilar?
Well,
I don't know that we have the time today.
I will in 1 minute, if I may, Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
with your indulgence. Section 1, that is new.
Where are you at? What page?
Page 1.
Page 1, Section 1, that has been revised, the proposal. Section 2, the new Section 2, contracts involving public facilities, that is new, and that is the exact language proposed under the prior proposal that you considered from Ms. Owen, the city clerk. Section 3, multiple year contracts, that is a new proposal. Section 4, discrimination clause, that's just a different number. It's the same proposal that the committee had already been looking at verbatim. Section 5, other than the language that you talked about, Mr. Chairman, council shall approve. It just brought it back to the mayor. And the rest of them are all just a recodification of what's already there.
What are the wishes of the
I
committee?
apologize for the confusion.
So that would be from 6 on? 34 and a half, 6 on?
6 on, yes, Councilor Aguilar. New section 6 on is just renumbered sections. The wording has not been changed.
I think Councilor Aguilar raises a good point. Our purpose was not to look at the purchasing issues, but the contract authorization issues. What are the wishes of the committee? Councilor Jameson.
If I get the answer maybe to one question,
Sure.
would be one of the wishes. Tell me, if you could please again, the language that was proposed that actually violates the charter, as you're saying, what language is that?
On the budget manuals, Councilor Jameson?
Any part of what we're trying to do here, what is it that's breaking the law?
I don't want to term it that way, Councilor. Certainly, you haven't done anything. This is all in the discussion stage.
Right.
And what I'm trying to do is certainly achieve your 3 goals while also complying with the charter. And I wouldn't say a legal label to it or anything like that, Councilor Jameson. I would more term it that the charter, when you read it all together, especially what the administrative function is, I mean, negotiating and awarding contracts is an administrative decision. However, in terms of how we can provide awareness and oversight to the council is certainly by prior notification before even bids are advertised, and notification in terms of anything above, I don't want to say $25,000 is a nominal amount, but in the big scheme of things, it really is. You're getting notification for anything over $25,000, as well as notification for any time a bid is about to be advertised. And I think that really solves quite a bit of those issues you were talking about.
Go ahead.
I just want to make sure I get this right. The awarding contracts, negotiations of contracts are construed to be administrative decisions by the mayor, and therefore then the council is not needed to participate in that discussion, other than what we're pressing you for.
No, here's where your role is, if I may. I don't
Yes.
mean to be disrespectful at all.
No, bring it on.
You're
This
my
is what-
client as well, and I respect what you folks do. You have the power of the purse. There's no money appropriated. These cannot go forward. If there's an appropriation approved by at least 5 of your members, and there's an allotment in place, a contract can only be entered into if there's unencumbered funds.
By encumbering them, we do that when we vote on the budget.
You encumber them by, well, I defer to Director Turback as well in terms of what's encumbered and not, or unencumbered. But the way I understand it is that they're encumbered either when you're voting on, and it's specifically stating this is what it's to be used for, or if it's, say there is a contract in place, they are encumbered until it's paid. So like if we enter into a contract for $20,000 for professional services with Jane Doe, the professional services allotment is encumbered now for $20,000. I'd certainly defer to Director Turback if that's not accurate from an accounting perspective.
Councilor Jameson, can I piggyback on that?
Go ahead.
So we get notice in the communications on the consent agenda of a $25,000 contract to buy widgets. You say we have the power of the purse, but that contract gets issued no matter what we do, and that money gets encumbered and spent without us having any checks or balance or oversight, correct?
On something like that, yes. But again,
So that
the
would be
competitive-
virtually every contract.
No, with all due respect, no, Mr. Chairman. 60 to 90% of the contracts or agreements are put to competitive bid. The council would be getting the awareness and the prior notification before the bidders are even made aware, and those bids are advertised for an invitation for bids. That's certainly oversight. In terms of certainly these other contracts, there's not as many. In terms of the entire scheme of things, I think the word most aptly describes how many are subject to the competitive bid process.
I think the train's too far down the tracks by that point. The council has no oversight, no checks and balances. Council Agler.
No, I was just wondering, would you repeat that percentage again as far as which go out to competitive bid? Did you say 60 to 90? Isn't that kind
Yes.
of broad?
Depending on the department, Councilor Aguilar, as I said
okay.
before, like Parks, Director Kearney could tell you, I think it's 90%, is that? For Parks? That's Scott Rust also saying Public Works would be near that number as well.
90?
But yeah, it would
Okay.
vary on the department, Councilor Aguilar, and that's why
Okay.
I'm using that range.
All right. I didn't know what the range pertained to.
Jameson.
This is also formal. It's always pretty easy just if we were sitting around a smaller table talking back and forth. But if I remember right, things that kind of set us off in the beginning was this. There was a couple of overlay projects that were done in Minnesota and Russell without even acknowledging the council and the existence of an oversight of that process and or whether it was a good idea or not. And there was $1 million or more involved in that practice. And how would that be prevented from this new?
Again, Councilor Jameson, to address that particular situation, it's my understanding that the competitive bid process for other projects had led to that surplusage that just simply was a very rare occurrence. Secondly, the process outlined in our proposal would certainly give the council advance notice before those street projects were being bid. As soon as the bid requests were out, approved by the mayor, it'd instantly go over to you folks. You'd have 5 to 7 days before they're even advertised, knowing that, oh, what are they doing here? I didn't realize we had some extra money involved. You would know about it. You could ask any questions you want of the administration. Hey, where's this $1 million coming from? Why are we doing this? And certainly the bids would have to be advertised for 2 consecutive weeks, or 2 consecutive Fridays, excuse me. So you would be getting at least a couple of weeks notice in advance before and even the bids are even open and considered.
We would be given awareness, but our ability to stop the bus would have to happen when we approve the budget.
Again, you have the power of the purse, Councilor Jameson, and certainly the city attorney's office has previously opined that certainly an appropriation may be subject to repeal or amendment, so you have that power. I'm not trying to diminish your power at all. It's very considerable. As anyone who operates even in a household where the wife handles the checkbook, we all know how the power of the purse is very, very significant in terms of what governs the household, and certainly it's the same for the city. Your power of appropriation is huge.
But there is a difference between asking permission and telling someone you're going to do it.
That's what I was wondering. Are we going about this all the wrong way? I mean, would we be better off with a resolution of some sort that just said if the administration is going to be doing something like this, that they, I don't know, give advice and consent from the council versus just going off and doing things? And, I mean, are we chasing this the wrong way? We're trying to bind him and put him into legal requirements that he act in a certain way, but wouldn't we be better off to just ask him to act in a certain way versus requiring him?
Keep in mind, a resolution has no teeth. It's just the council saying this is what we want.
So we got to give teeth.
Councilor
Mr.
Aguilar.
Chair, are we going to take testimony from any other audience members?
We certainly can if the council questions are done. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address this issue? Councilor Anderson.
Thank you for your time, committee. Kenny Anderson, Sioux Falls. I guess some of the things that I've heard I don't disagree with as far as the bid process. But the contracts that we haven't discussed are the contracts that are the personal services contracts, the ones that really started this discussion. You know, we want to talk about the Arena Convention Center, which 1 year the council decided that contract. Another year it went to the mayor. So we're not even following this administration decision here that's in the charter, and maybe that needs to be amended. We also have the Pavilion, the Orpheum Theater. There's other entities out there that we have not covered here on this. And those are the type of contracts that, in my discussions with a few of you, that I have brought up. And those are issues that we definitely need to, I feel, control or get control of. These contracts are not done out in the open, and then all of a sudden we're being told about these contracts. We've already given the money out, so we don't have any control from that point. We've seen it with, you know, other different contracts that were done for the River Greenway, where there was contracts done on that weren't really given to the city or to the council until we asked a little bit more about them. And so that's the reasons why I feel that we need to continue on the track that we are right now. Yes, there does need to be more discussion, but I think we are on the right track as far as contracts here in the city, and that the council needs to have not, you know, just informational, but we need to be more transparent between the council and the administration on what is happening in these contracts, especially some of the small ones that happen inside a larger contract. And those have been some of the issues that have come up and become bigger issues. So I hope that we will continue this discussion, and I still, you know, think we are on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Anderson. Are there others in the audience that would like to address the issue? Director Cotter.
Thank you, Council Chair. Mark Cotter with the Office of Public Works. I would just like to say a few comments. Most are germane to what I've said in the past. But as this gets back to the point of when dollars were moved from the Arterial Street program into the Mill and Overlay program, some of the nature of those decisions were not only the condition of the streets, but it also was predicated that we'd already bid our major project in the Arterial Street expansion program. And so when we look across where our available dollars were, where we're getting our calls from our citizens, really where we need to, after we had considerable rains that happened that fall, and I still stand behind it, it was the right decision to actually overlay Russell Street and Minnesota Avenue. I think the key thing that I failed to do is notify the council that that intent of that CIP project of the Arterial Street expansion was transferred. It was inside of Public Works, but that transfer did happen to make sure that we could actually make Minnesota Avenue and Russell Street drivable. From the beginning, obviously, with Public Works, we do a number of contracts. We have a very tight construction period each year. And so we've tried to offer some items that could actually streamline the process but open up that awareness. Certainly hoping that the publishing the bid awards early would suffice some of that intent, but then also to allow us to really maximize our 7-month construction window here. And so I know that doesn't get to some of the specifics of the legality, but when it ultimately comes down to executing the dollars and putting them to work, that's what we do the best. And if we can find a way to streamline that process, that's some of the amendments that we've offered. That would be something that we would greatly support. So thank you very much.
And I think, speaking for myself, I certainly support, I like the idea of us seeing, before the bids are advertised, us being able to see that. Councilor Karski.
Well, a couple of things come to mind, I guess. One of them is, as the council, we're basically right now appropriating a budget, and we're allowing the mayor to award the contract where it is, and that's, what we're trying to change. And I guess when I look at that and I think about the history that's been brought up, I see things like the general public saying how did we get 2 contracts for managing our facilities? How was that money able to be spent on this? What's the city council doing? And, we appropriate money, but that money, okay, yes, it was left over, but that should be our money to spend and decide where that money is spent. And it shouldn't rest with one person or one department, I guess. And I think that's what we need to take control of right here, and I'm hoping that's the direction that we end up going.
Other comments? Councilor Erpenbach?
Acting as a citizen, Michelle Erpenbach. A question for the committee and perhaps for the attorney is, if we look at that list again, and if we might, could we have that list again? Look at the items that are on that list and tell me which, as a citizen, I could go in and actually take petitions to have a referendum on any of these issues. I obviously can't do anything in terms of hiring, disciplining employees. But if I really, as a citizen, have problems with the way the streets are being built or the management contracts with the convention center and the arena, this is one of the things we need to look at. We need to look beyond just the street issues. We need to look into all of those expanded issues, as Kenny was referring to, and think about, as a citizen, can I refer the budget? Can I refer negotiating contracts? Can I refer awarding contracts? And are we, because we make it administrative decisions, are we taking that power away from the citizens? And I ask it as a question because I'm not sure I know the answer. But I think it's part of the question, and it's part of this conversation for you to continue to consider. And I've said to you individually, at least to some of you, that I do support the idea of bringing that role back into the role of the council in terms of all contracts. I guess I'm speaking now as a counselor, but I want you to think in terms of, I understand there is unique language in our charter, and there are in a lot of cases unique language in our charter that we ignore on a regular basis. And so I would be concerned that we're picking and choosing which pieces of that charter we ignore. And so let's tread this, and let's remember who it is that we do represent, and it is the citizens, it is not the administration.
More of a comment than a question, but I find it surprising that founders of the charter would have wanted the council just to come in and approve the budget and then give the bag of money and walk away from the table and not have any oversight or checks or balances afterwards.
But it was my understanding that that was the first draft. And again, I go back to, this is 18 years later, and a lot of the premises, and again, some of the language in the charter itself is still up for interpretation. We saw that when we were going for the budget analyst position. And so, I just think that we probably are on the right track. I guess that I started out looking at this maybe more minimally than some of the other council members, but I guess that I'm seeing that there is too much protesting maybe. It's raising a lot of questions in my mind, and I just can't go along with the $250,000.
No, and I think we were clear about that. The other item, too, the charter says that we're supposed to have a charter revision commission in place at all points, but we've chosen to ignore that for the last year. So it goes back to Councilor Erpenbach, which parts do we ignore and which parts do we get to abide by? That doesn't make sense. Well, there was a lot to digest in this, committee members. I would propose that we get together again before our next meeting and figure out the path we want to take, because given the hour, I don't think we're going to be able to do that today. Does that sound reasonable to the committee?
I like the idea, and maybe we could include the city attorney in that discussion as well. I would have to
It'd be an open public meeting.
express a feeling of a desire to have more support, if that's the right way to say it, but more involvement, more help. It's probably not the right way to say it, but more interaction, let's just say it, with the city attorney on this process, and not wait for a moment like this to find ourselves at odds again, like we've done a month after month after month. Let's either come together and figure this out or kill it.
I think by the next meeting, we need to vote it up or down.
Yes.
We need to make a decision, because we have been very clear on what the intent of this was, and revision after revision, it's not coming back as to what the intent that the council wanted. All right, I will email all of you and work through the clerk's office to find a meeting time where we can revisit this issue and this issue alone in the next, should we say, 2 weeks? Does that work? Very good. Item 3B, discussion on sewer water rate increase freeze for elderly and low-income families. Councilor Jamieson, do you want to introduce this?
Sure. It came up, this item came up on a phone call that I had received from several individuals who were concerned about the increase in water rates. And, I was just thinking and struggling with how we could do anything to help them, knowing that the increases were needed and necessary. And I struggled through it, and I was just thinking, and I thought, well, what about the property tax rate freeze that occurs for elderly individuals in our counties, and thought whether or not that would be applicable to water rates or not. And I didn't know what the impact would be. I didn't know if it was even a good idea to even think about. But I did contact Mark Cotter, and we talked about it a little bit. I know he's done a little research on it, and so it's really just an effort to provide a solution to some individuals in our community who are for sure struggling with paying an increase of $1 or $2 on basic utilities like water. So,
Director Cotter, do you want to address the issue, please?
Certainly. Well, what we've done some research, and communities do a variety of programs, whether they sometimes dovetail under the property tax freeze, whether they allow them to do it annually. Some programs allow them to do it basically one time as a customer. And so we just took a look initially at how many property tax freezes have come to the city council this year, and so far we counted 49. And so we escalated that up to 100, assuming that there would be the same amount that would happen throughout the year, and looked at a few different strategies. In just one sample, I think 12 out of 13 used 4 consumption units or less. So we looked at what 4 consumption units would produce as a bill in 2012, and this is for water. That would produce $13.32 for that bill. And if there was an elected 10% reduction, that would be $1.33. If there was $2, it would be 15% would be $2 reduction per month. 20% reduction would be $2.66. And so those numbers then just get escalated up by 100 customers. And so overall, there's it's not a large dollar amount by any means, but I think too one of the things that we as a team, and Trent Lubers, our utility administration professional here, is that's over water and wastewater. We also took a look back at, we've actually indirectly been providing rate relief with the conservation programs that we've done over time, and with the rebates on toilets and dishwashers. Those two alone are in the top 3 uses of a household. And so if you can provide a device that not only cuts their consumption but also provides a rebate to that purchase, and we just in Sioux Falls, on your first toilet that you replace, you get a $75 rebate. You essentially can buy a toilet today for $75. So not only to take your device from 3.5 gallons down to 1.6 will greatly reduce your water usage. That'll also, it's essentially a free device. And so one of the things that I would share with the City Council, and this goes back before my time, possibly started with Vernon with the start of the rebate program that I initially was told went through the Public Services Committee, that this city has, just like other cities have a series of programs on how they provide rate relief. I would say the City of Sioux Falls has been doing it for a number of years indirectly and probably the right way. Instead of just providing a financial offset, you're actually providing the device that long-term provides us less water that we have to take out of the source water, well fields, or buy from ultimately Lewis and Clark, treat, and then push out. You're changing a culture not only and providing some rate relief. So we did a couple of numbers because you guys know council members know that we love spreadsheets, and I didn't bring one of those fancy graphs, which I'm sure some are disappointed. But essentially, and Trent Lubers was the original author of the rebate program, and so as there's details, we'll bring up Trent. But just looking at the number of toilets and washing machines that have been rebated since 2003, we can quantify that amount of water per device. And so we've essentially done an offset of 1.4 billion gallons of water just in the toilets and washing machines that we've rebated. And then the cost of the program, each year we fund this program at about $310,000 to $350,000 based on the annual year and what we project we'll receive in rebates. So the cost of the program since 2003 has cost the water division, ultimately the customers, $2 million, $41,147. But the offset, if we use the average of what water costs over that last period at $2.27 per consumption unit, we've actually ultimately, with the investment of just over $2 million, we've saved the customers $4.3 million. And so I think that's a great statement for what the City of Sioux Falls does not only provide a direct offset to their bill, based on how many strategies. The other thing that we didn't add up, but there are other rebates, is that with the timer adjustments, the shower heads, those other strategies that if you give out a water kit that can cost anywhere from about $6 and $4 if you have a residential house or a commercial, an apartment. There's 2 different kits you can purchase. We don't quantify what those people are offsetting if they do put their shower head in or use the hose. So in addition to just the toilet and the clothes washer, you're even reaching beyond that to provide more rate relief. So there is options, and I would say that program is still heavily used. One of the things that we were able to do this year with the new billing software, instead of cutting checks, all these rebate checks, we just provide them an offset in their bill. So if they normally have a $75 bill, which most people don't, but if they buy a toilet, they essentially get 1 month of water free. So with that, I can try to answer some questions.
Questions? Councilor Jameson.
So are you suggesting that the elderly and poor should not be given a property or a water rate freeze because it would impact the water system too dramatically, and we would wind up subsidizing other water uses for people?
No, I'm not saying that. And obviously that's a council decision to have a program like that. I just wanted you, as we looked at it, a number of cities that have a variety of means. Just next door in Brandon, the Southeastern Electric utility, actually, you're allowed to check your bill and round it up to the nearest dollar, and they take those proceeds, and not everyone in Brandon does it, but there are some people in the Public Works team that live there that do it, and they use those proceeds to provide rate relief for whatever their criteria is on electric bills. So,
And when you tabulated the total amount of the individuals who are applying for and receiving the property tax rate freeze and quantified those up, rounded them up to 100 or so, what was the impact?
assuming a 20% rate reduction on 100 applicants. Now, this is whether this would actually pick up or not. You know, the offset in your actual tax bill is significant when you go through this program. Obviously, the offset in your water bill is very insignificant. And so we'll have to see how many people would actually do it. But for a 20% rate reduction, it would be just over $3,200. And so...
Per month?
we also see. Go ahead. The other strategy that we had heard was that they would freeze rates, and so if we've talked about doing 1 to 5 year rate increase schedules, so there's only one action that comes to the city council for that period of time. One of the strategies that some communities have done is that if you qualify for the program, that they'll freeze your rate at the beginning rate. Say if you implemented 2005 to 2010 rate increases, if you qualified for the program, you could freeze your rate at 2005 level. And so that was yet another strategy on how, but then at 2010, those individuals jumped to the 2010 level. And so it does provide rate relief for a period of time, but they do get reset at the end of that rate adjustment period, and they ultimately start to pay. So they've got to start setting aside dollars to get raised up to that next year. So
I'm going to set the 1 minute bell off here because we need to get cleared out so the clerks can get ready for the 7 o'clock. One more question, Councilor Aguilar.
One of the things that was disturbing during the public input was some of these individuals that live alone or with one under their individual. I know that someone came forward and said her bill was like $40 for the month, and in that same month, there's 2 people in our household, but I had kids home, and we power washed our house to have it painted and whatever, and my bill was the same as that individual. So I'm taking it that there's a problem. Do we do any type of awareness campaigns or whatever as far as if someone was having those unusually high, what I would consider high, what they could do, who they should contact, whatever?
We do 2 things. We publish a pamphlet that encourages people, 3, to know how to read their water meter and to periodically test it themselves. They can shut everything off in the house and then go down and see there's 2 dials. Go down and see if the small dial is spinning at all. That'll tell you if you've got one toilet leaking or some stent. In the conservation kits, there's dye tablets that you can see if there's any dye that's streaming from your tank into there. The next thing, which is really nice with our new software, is that we know what your normal band usage is. And if it goes significantly up, we place a phone call. And then what our IVR, the interactive voice response system, which we'll have online in about 10 weeks, that will actually do automated calls. And so there's just a number of strategies that people will be able to do. If you are on vacation out of state, you can today get your usage online, and you could actually log on, and you would hope that every day you're gone there's been no increased rates because we read your water meter twice a day. So there's a number of those strategies, but probably the best one is just to let the technology work. And if we know that your normal operating band is X, and if it goes whatever our settings are above that, they'll actually get a phone call today from a billing clerk.
Great.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, I'm going to declare the meeting adjourned at 6:43.
All right, thank you.